They said Cornelius Drummond had lost. They said the Duke of Drummond had nothing left to fear, that a public confession on a summer lawn had ended it, that a ring on his wife's hand had closed the matter for good. They were wrong. On a quiet road to Bath, in the third month of a hard winter, one bolt gave way beneath a carriage wheel, and everything Verity Drummond had ever learned about her husband's body, everything a decade at her father's side had taught her about fever and fear and the particular arithmetic of a failing pulse, she was about to need in a single terrible night. This is a story about the cost of being underestimated twice by the same man, and what a physician's daughter carries with her even after she has become a duchess. About a marriage built on honesty, tested now not by secrets, but by a silence of a different kind entirely. The silence of a man who will not wake, in a farmhouse bedroom with the frost thickening on the glass. About the particular courage it takes not to save a life once, in a lit ballroom with the whole county watching, but to hold on to one, hour by hour, alone, with no one watching at all, until morning finally, mercifully, arrives. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. The city, the hour, what's keeping you company on the walk home or the drive or the quiet room. I read everyone. This story is a work of fiction set in a lightly reimagined Regency England. Medical details are simplified for narrative purposes and should not be taken as guidance. Drummond Park, December 1817. Frost had taken the rose garden entirely. The arbour where they had once sat with petals dropping onto warm stone now bare and silvered, the roses themselves cut back to black-knuckled stems, the cat curled somewhere indoors with the good sense of an animal that understood seasons a great deal better than most people did. Verity Drummond stood at the east room window with a cup of chocolate, cooling untouched in her hand, and watched her husband cross the frozen lawn toward the stables, his greatcoat dark against the white, his breath clouding ahead of him, his left hand ungloved and swinging loosely at his side, as though it had never once in his life been a thing to hide. It had been 9 months since Bridewell Park, 9 months since a lawn full of the county had watched a duke hold up his own trembling hand in the July sun and dare anyone present to make something of it. Nothing had come of Cornelius since, no letters, no petitions, no London physicians stationed politely at the margins of parties with small leather notebooks and careful eyes. Rafferty said when she asked, which she still did perhaps more often than was strictly necessary, that his cousin had simply run out of angles to try. Verity, who had spent a decade watching her father treat men who had run out of money rather than angles, and who understood better than most that the two conditions were rarely unrelated for long, found she did not entirely believe it. She said nothing of this at breakfast or at supper, or in the quiet hour before sleep when he read beside her, with his spectacles low on his nose and his left hand resting unhidden on the coverlet between them. A marriage built on honesty, she had learned in 9 months of practicing one, did not require her to manufacture alarm where she had no evidence yet to support it. It required instead a particular patience, the same patience she brought to a diagnosis not yet confirmed, watching, waiting, gathering what small signs presented themselves before speaking a word aloud that could not afterward be unsaid. She finished the chocolate, cold now and faintly bitter, and told herself this was an ordinary morning, and very nearly believed it. The letter from the estate steward at Drummond Park's Northumberland holding arrived on a Tuesday. Delivered with the second post alongside a parcel of medical journals Verity had been awaiting from Edinburgh for a fortnight, and Rafferty read it at the breakfast table with the particular economy of movement she had learned, in 3 years of marriage, meant he was working to keep his face from telling her something before he had finished deciding how he wished to say it. "Cornelius has sold the Northumberland cottage," he said finally, folding the letter once along its original crease, "and the small parcel of land adjoining it, grazing rights included, which suggests he was not in a position to negotiate for more favourable terms. The steward writes that he settled with a moneylender in Newcastle rather than approaching a bank in the ordinary way, which suggests further that the terms themselves were not generous, whatever they were. He is in debt. He has been in debt for some time, I expect. I simply did not know how deeply, and I confess I had stopped inquiring some months ago, on the theory that a man who no longer troubled us was a man better left untroubled in return." He set the letter beside his plate and did not pick up his coffee, though it sat within easy reach of his right hand, steaming faintly in the cold morning air of the breakfast room. A man who has run out of legal recourse and is now also running out of money is not a man I would call finished, Verity. He is a man who has run out of patience. Those are not the same condition, and I have been treating them as though they were, which I now think was an error of some consequence. You think he will do something? I think, Rafferty said carefully, turning his coffee cup a quarter turn without drinking from it, a habit she had noted years ago and never once remarked upon, that I would like to travel to Bath next week, regardless of any of this, to finalize the settlement papers with Lord Aldworth, while the legal matter is still fresh in the courts and the magistrate's memory both, so that whatever Cornelius attempts next, if he attempts anything at all, he attempts it against a door that is already closed, rather than one still standing open on his account. She had not liked the phrase, whatever Cornelius attempts next, delivered as it was with the same level, unhurried calm he might have used to discuss the weather or the state of the roads. She had not said so. There were things a marriage taught you to carry quietly, without setting them down heavily on the breakfast table between the toast and the marmalade, and this, she decided, watching him fold the letter a second time and tuck it into the inner pocket of his coat with his right hand was, for the present at least, one of them. That afternoon Poppy Ingram called, as she did perhaps twice a season now that her own marriage and Verity's title had drawn them into slightly different circles that nonetheless still crossed, and the two of them sat in the small parlour with tea going cold between them, while Poppy delivered with evident relish the full accounting of every engagement, elopement, and minor scandal Bath had produced since her last visit. "You are not attending," Poppy said eventually, setting down her cup with the particular sharpness of a woman who has noticed her audience has wandered. "You have that look, the one you had at assemblies, before you were a duchess, when you were cataloguing someone's tremor instead of listening to a word I said." "I am listening. You are not. What is it?" Verity considered for a moment whether to say anything at all and found, as she generally did with Poppy, who had known her since they shared Latin lessons in a draughty rectory and had never once, in 20 years, repeated a confidence entrusted to her, that she wanted to say it aloud, if only to hear how it sounded outside the privacy of her own head. "Cornelius has sold property. He is in debt to a moneylender. Rafferty believes it means nothing has ended, only that the shape of the danger has changed." Poppy's teasing dropped away entirely. "And what do you believe?" "I believe," Verity said slowly, "that I have a new groom in the stables with good letters from Newcastle, who checks the carriage wheels with more attention than the task requires, and I have no evidence whatsoever connecting the two facts, and I dislike very much that I am nonetheless connecting them." "Then tell him that." "And say what, precisely?" "That I dislike the way a groom polishes an axle." He would not laugh at me. He has never once laughed at an instinct of mine, not from the first evening I told him about his own hand in an assembly room. But he would worry without a single fact to worry about, and I have watched what unfocused worry does to him. It does not make him careful. It makes him manage things alone again, at a distance, exactly the habit he has spent 3 years trying to unlearn. I would rather bring him a fact than a feeling. Poppy studied her for a long moment over the cooling tea, with the particular clear-eyed attention of a woman who had watched her friend build an entire life's philosophy out of precisely this instinct, for better and on occasion for worse. "You have always preferred to be certain before you speak. It is why you make such a fine physician, and I sometimes think it is also why you nearly did not cross that assembly room 3 years ago, dare or no dare, until you had already diagnosed the man from 20 feet away." "I do not regret being careful." "I did not say you should," Poppy said. "I only observe that certainty in matters of the heart or matters of danger both sometimes arrives a great deal later than one would wish it to, and I hope, whatever this is, that it does not cost you the difference. He knows my instincts as well as I do. If I raise it without evidence, he will worry, and worrying does not suit him. He manages it by doing, not by sitting with it, and there is nothing yet to do." She looked at the cold tea, the small fire, the frost thickening on the parlour windows. "I will watch the groom instead. Quietly. It is, after all, what I am good at." Poppy left an hour later, wrapped against the cold in a fur-lined pelisse, but paused at the door long enough to press Verity's hand once, firmly. "Write to me. Whatever comes of it, do not sit with it alone in that enormous house pretending you are managing perfectly well. You have never once in 20 years been as composed as you like people to believe, and I have always thought it your one genuinely irritating quality. I will write. See that you do." And then, more gently, "I am glad you found him, Verity, whatever comes. I have watched you be clever about a great many things in your life and rarely, before him, watched you be happy about any of them at the same time." Verity stood at the window long after the carriage had gone, watching the last of the daylight fail over the frosted park, and found herself thinking not of Cornelius or the moneylender in Newcastle, but of the first evening she had ever seen Rafferty Drummond, a man standing motionless in a corner for an hour, protecting a hand he believed made him unworthy of being seen clearly by anyone. She had spent 3 years teaching him otherwise. She was not now, she told herself, walking away from that lesson merely because a new groom checked an axle too carefully. She would watch. She would gather what evidence presented itself. And she would trust, as she always had, the discipline that had never yet failed her, even as some quieter, less disciplined part of her wished, standing alone in the darkening window, that she had simply said the words aloud at breakfast and let him worry. The carriage was readied on the Thursday before their departure for Bath, the household staff moving through the ordinary business of preparing trunks and provisions for a journey of several days, and Verity, restless with a worry she had still not fully permitted herself to name, went out to the stable yard in the last grey light of afternoon under the pretence of confirming the departure hour with the head coachman, and found instead Josiah beneath the travelling carriage with a lantern, his hands moving along the axle with a thoroughness that seemed, to her eye, considerably in excess of what the task ought to have required. "Is something amiss with it?" she asked, keeping her voice light, unhurried, the same voice she used at a bedside when she did not yet wish a patient to understand how closely she was watching them. He came out from beneath the carriage too quickly, cracked the back of his head lightly against the frame, and straightened with a wince he tried, not entirely successfully, to hide. "No, Your Grace. Only checking her over proper for the road. Long way to Bath this time of year, and the low stretch past Farley gets treacherous when the frost sets hard." "That is conscientious of you." "Yes, Your Grace." His eyes did not quite meet hers, sliding instead toward the lantern, the axle, the darkening yard behind her. Anywhere, she noted, but her own face. "Wouldn't want nothing going wrong. Roads is bad this season. Ice under the frost in the low parts where the drainage runs poor." It was, she would think later, turning it over in the dark hours of a night still some days off, an entirely reasonable thing for a groom to say, and an entirely reasonable thing for a groom to be doing, on the eve of a long winter journey with his master's life, quite literally riding upon the soundness of his work. She had no cause that Thursday evening to do anything other than nod and thank him for his diligence, and continue toward the house, the cold coming up hard through the soles of her boots, the lantern light retreating behind her, as Josiah bent once more beneath the carriage with the particular haste of a man glad to be alone again. She mentioned it to no one. She told herself, walking back across the frosted yard with her arms wrapped tight against the chill, that a groom checking his axles carefully before a long winter road was not a groom to be feared, but a groom doing his work well. The very quality, after all, that had recommended him for the position in the first place, according to his good Newcastle letters. She was nearly convinced of this by the time she reached the kitchen door. Nearly. She had learned in a decade of medicine at her father's side that the body rarely lied even when the mind very much wished it would, and hers had gone cold, standing in that stable yard, in a way that had nothing at all to do with December. She lay awake later that night beside Rafferty's steady breathing and turned it over, the too quick straightening, the eyes that would not settle, the thoroughness that read on reflection less like diligence and more like a man checking his own work against instructions he had been given, rather than instructions his conscience had supplied unprompted. She almost woke him to say so. She did not. There was, she told herself again, nothing yet to say that would not sound spoken aloud in the dark, like exactly the sort of alarm she had promised herself she would not manufacture without cause. She would think of that decision often in the days that followed. and wish with a fierceness that surprised her that she had woken him anyway. They departed at 9 the following morning, under a sky the colour of old pewter. Mrs. Drake settled beside Verity with a foot warmer and a flask of tea gone lukewarm within the hour, despite her best efforts. Rafferty across from them with a stack of correspondence he did not open, watching instead the frost-white fields pass beyond the window with the particular quiet of a man doing arithmetic he had not yet chosen to share aloud. "So you are thinking about Cornelius," Verity said once Mrs. Drake had dozed against the window in the manner that had become, over 2 winters of travelling together, less a coincidence than a small and reliable courtesy. "I am thinking that Lord Aldworth's signature on those papers will end a great many possibilities at once," Rafferty said, "which is either an excellent reason to travel today or an excellent reason for someone else to prefer very much that I did not arrive." He looked at her then, and something in his expression softened, the arithmetic set briefly aside. "I did not intend to say that aloud. Forgive me. I would rather you spent the journey looking at the hedgerows than at my face doing sums it has no business doing in front of you. I would rather know what sums you are doing than watch you do them silently and pretend otherwise," Verity said. "You could have sent the papers by courier and stayed at home by the fire, where I would worry a great deal less." "I could have," he agreed. "I did not want to." He turned his hand over on his knee, palm upward, an invitation she had learned to recognize and answer without hesitation. "I find I dislike managing things at a distance, where you are concerned, or where Cornelius is concerned, or in truth where anything that matters to me is concerned. Old habit, from 3 years of managing everything alone and calling it strength. I am attempting, with mixed success, to unlearn it." She reached across the narrow space of the carriage and took his left hand, the one that trembled now with a rhythm she had catalogued so thoroughly over 3 years of marriage that she could have identified it blind, by touch alone, in a room of 100 other hands. He turned his palm fully to meet hers, and for a while they rode in silence that was not empty but full of hedgerows sliding past white with frost, full of the horses' steady rhythm on the frozen road, full of the particular ease 2 people build between them when they have long since stopped needing conversation to prove the marriage is working. "Tell me something ordinary," she said eventually. "Not Cornelius, not the estate. Something ordinary." He considered this with the same care he gave to correspondence. "The mare with the slight lameness, Munby's replacement, Josiah, is it? Tells me the trouble is in the near foreleg, not the hoof itself, and recommends we rest her through the new year, rather than have the farrier attempt anything before spring." Something in Verity went very still, though she kept her face composed with the same discipline that had carried her through 100 consultations. "Josiah told you that himself?" "By way of the head groom, yes, this morning before we left." "Why?" "No reason," she said, and heard how thin it sounded even as she said it, and pressed on before he could ask further. "Only that he seems very attentive for so new a man. Munby recommended him warmly before his knees gave out entirely. I have no cause to doubt the recommendation." Rafferty studied her face for a moment longer than the subject seemed to warrant, the particular attention of a man who had spent 3 years learning to read the smallest shifts in her expression, the way she had once learned to read the smallest tremor in his hand. "You are cataloguing something." "I am cataloguing nothing," she said, which was, she knew even as she spoke it, not entirely true, and he knew it too, and let it pass regardless, because the road climbed now toward the long hill above Farley, hedgerows white with frost on either side, the horse's breath clouding thick in the cold, and there would be time, she told herself, to say the rest of it once they had reached the inn at the crest of the hill and could speak properly, without Mrs. Drake stirring at every raised word. There was not time. It was there on the steep decline where the road narrowed sharply between an embankment thick with frozen bracken and a stand of bare elms, where the coachman would say afterward, over and over, to anyone who would listen, that he had felt nothing wrong, nothing at all, right up until the moment the carriage was already going, that the front offside wheel came away from the axle entirely, and the world tipped sideways with a violence that carried no warning in it whatsoever. Verity would remember it afterward only in pieces, and out of order, the way the mind kept only what it could hold at the time and returned the rest later, unasked, at the most inconvenient hours, 3 in the morning most often, for weeks afterward, the sound arriving before the memory had even fully formed around it. The sound first, a crack too large and too wrong for wood alone, followed almost instantly by a lurch that threw Mrs. Drake hard against the door and threw Verity in the same violent motion against Rafferty's shoulder, and then the carriage was no longer travelling on wheels at all, but sliding, grinding, screeching along the frozen embankment, the horses screaming in a register she had never before heard from an animal and hoped never to hear again. And then, all at once, it stopped, jarring, absolute, against the packed earth and stone of the bank, and the world went very quiet in a way that frightened her considerably more than the noise had. Mrs. Drake was moving, dazed but moving, her voice already climbing toward the edge of panic, one hand pressed to a cut above her eyebrow that bled freely but shallowly, the kind of wound Verity's trained eye dismissed almost before it had finished registering it. She did not have the luxury of panic, and would not permit herself one, not yet. Not until she had done the thing she had spent a decade training herself to do, before feeling was allowed any purchase at all. She turned toward her husband, and found him slumped against the door of the carriage with blood at his temple, dark and glistening in the grey afternoon light, and his eyes closed, and his whole frame unnaturally still, in a way that made something in her chest seize and refuse, for one endless half-second to move at all. Rafferty! Nothing. She pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw, found the pulse there, fast, thin but present, unmistakably present, and let out a breath she had not known, until that instant she was holding. "Rafferty, look at me. I need you to look at me." He did not. Not yet. Outside, the coachman was shouting something about the horses, something about the wheel lying shattered 20 feet up the embankment where it had come to rest, and Mrs. Drake had somehow got the upper door open despite her own dazed state, letting a rush of bitter air flood into the wreck. And through all of it, Verity assessed her husband with hands that did not shake, even as everything else within her wanted very much to. A laceration at the temple, bleeding freely but not, on inspection, dangerously. Head wounds always bled more than their true severity warranted. Her father had drilled that into her before she was 15, and she repeated it to herself now like a prayer. His left arm lay at an angle that told her before she had even touched it precisely what had happened to the collarbone beneath the greatcoat. His breathing was shallow but even, unobstructed. No blood at the mouth. No sign, thank every mercy she could name, of the internal catastrophe she had feared most, in the first terrible half-second after the wheel gave way. He struck his head against the doorframe, she said aloud, to no one in particular, to herself, the way she had learned over years of crisis to narrate her own findings, so that the calm, assessing part of her mind could not slip sideways into the part that only wanted to weep. He is breathing. The arm is broken, not the ribs, thank God, not the ribs. We need him warm and we need him kept still, and we need a physician within the hour, or we bring the physician to him rather than him to the physician. It took the coachman and a farmer's boy, who came running across a frozen field at the sound of the crash, the better part of 20 minutes to right the wreck sufficiently to free the lower door entirely, and through all of it, Verity knelt in the frozen ditch beside her husband, with her own cloak stripped off and wrapped tightly around him, despite the bitter cold biting at her through her gown, his head cradled carefully against her knees, and she talked to him without pause the entire time, about the mare's lameness, about the letter from the Edinburgh physician still waiting unanswered on her writing desk, about nothing whatsoever of consequence, because she had read once, in her father's oldest and most battered medical text, that the unconscious sometimes heard a great deal more than the living generally credited them with, and she was not prepared. Kneeling in a frozen ditch above Farley, with the light already beginning to fail, to test the opposite possibility. They carried him, on a hurdle borrowed from the farmer's own barn, and padded with every blanket the small household could produce, to the nearest dwelling, a modest farmhouse belonging to a family named Kestrel, who gave up their own bedroom without a moment's hesitation once Mrs. Drake, recovered enough to be useful, made clear precisely whom they were sheltering, and Verity worked through the remainder of that grey afternoon and deep into the evening by candlelight and the farm wife's banked fire, setting the collarbone as best the materials at hand allowed, cleaning and dressing the wound at his temple with a steadiness of hand she would only afterward recognize as remarkable, given the state of everything beneath it, And then, with the practical necessities exhausted, waiting, with the particular helplessness of a physician who has done everything medically available to her, and now has nothing whatsoever left to do but watch. He woke twice in those first hours, disoriented and plainly in pain, confused about the room, the bed, the strange low ceiling above him, and both times his eyes found hers before they found anything else at all, and both times he said her name, only her name, nothing else, as though it were the one fact in the world he had retained with any certainty, before he asked anything about where he was or what had happened. Both times she held his uninjured hand between both of hers and told him low and steady that he was safe, that she was there, that he had only to rest, and watched him slide back under before she could be entirely certain he had believed a word of it. The fever came on the second night. She recognized it before even the farm wife did, before Rafferty's own body seemed fully to have registered what was happening within it. A subtle, treacherous heat beneath her palm at his forehead that had not been there at supper, a restlessness threading through his sleep that had not been there an hour before, a flush climbing along his cheekbones that the candlelight, cruelly, made look almost like the flush of health rather than its opposite. By midnight, it had climbed further still. By 2 in the morning he was speaking, low and urgent, to people who were not in the room. His father, she thought once, and Cornelius, twice, in a tone she had never once heard him use, raw and unguarded in a way 3 years of careful composure had never permitted her to witness while he was waking. His right hand plucking restlessly at the blanket, his left arm, bound and splinted, held rigid against his chest in a way that told her some deep animal part of him was still, even lost in fever, protecting it. "The wound at the temple has taken an infection," she said to the farm wife, keeping her voice as level as the effort cost her, which was considerable. "Send your boy to Bath for my father, Dr. Merriweather, at the address I will write for you, and to the nearest physician besides, whoever can be reached fastest. Tell them fever, tell them head injury, tell them to come now, tonight, not in the morning, because morning may be too late to matter." She did not sleep. She sat beside the narrow bed through the black, endless hours of that second night, with a basin of cold well water and a stack of cloths she changed against his burning forehead every quarter hour by the small clock the kestrels kept on their mantel, counting his pulse against her own steady heartbeat, murmuring to him in the low hours when the fever seemed to loosen its grip enough that he might perhaps hear something of what she said. She told him about the roses at Drummond Park, about the cat asleep somewhere in the house, without the faintest concern for either of them, about the ring his mother had kept wrapped in linen for 11 years, waiting for a reason to be unwrapped. She told him she was not finished arguing with him about a great many matters, and that she had no intention whatsoever of losing the argument by forfeit. Somewhere near 4 in the morning, in the particular exhausted honesty that belongs only to the deepest, loneliest part of the night, she allowed herself once, and only once, to consider in full what her life would look like if this did not resolve the way she needed it to, and found the thought so entirely unbearable, so far beyond anything her considerable professional composure could withstand, that she set it down immediately, physically, like a weight she had picked up by mistake, and did not permit herself to lift it again. Grief, she told herself firmly, was a luxury reserved strictly for afterward. This was not yet afterward. This was still, God willing, the part where something could still be done. Her father arrived a little past dawn, gout entirely forgotten in the face of his daughter's summons, his own medical bag clutched in a hand that had not held it in earnest for weeks, and between the two of them, working now with the easy, wordless coordination born of a decade sharing the same dispensary, they confirmed within the hour what Verity had already, in her own private terror, suspected. The fever was an infection taken hold in the wound at the temple, dangerous certainly, potentially very dangerous indeed, but not if managed correctly and caught as early as it had been, beyond hope. "You have done everything correctly," her father told her quietly in the farmhouse kitchen, while the second physician they had sent for examined Rafferty upstairs. "Everything I would have done myself, and perhaps a degree more carefully than I would have managed it, given the circumstances." He studied her face in the grey morning light, the exhaustion plainly written across it. "You are also not permitting yourself to sit down or eat or sleep which is not medically sound practice for the physician any more than for the patient, Verity. I will sleep when he is better. You will collapse before that if you continue as you are, and then I will have 2 patients in this farmhouse instead of 1. He took her hand briefly, the way he had not done since she was a girl, bringing him a dosage error to correct. He will recover. I have seen worse fevers turn, and this one is already showing signs of breaking by morning, if I am not mistaken. Sit down. Eat something. He would tell you the same, were he able. She sat briefly and ate almost nothing, and returned to the bedside within the half-hour regardless, because her father was, in this one matter at least, entirely correct about what Rafferty would have told her, and entirely wrong about her capacity to heed it, while he still lay fevered and unreachable in the next room. It was in those same 3 days, while Verity kept her vigil and the fever slowly, agonizingly began at last to loosen its grip, that Lord Aldworth's own investigation, set in motion by the coachman's furious, unshakable insistence that a well-maintained axle simply did not fail on a road he had driven 40 times without the smallest incident, began quietly to produce results of its own. While her father sat with Rafferty through the worst of the second night, Verity, unable to sit still with fear a moment longer than the vigil strictly required of her, walked out alone into the frozen dark to where the wreck of the carriage still lay half in the ditch above Farley, a lantern in one hand, and her cloak drawn tight against a cold that had stopped some hours before, troubling her nearly as much as it ought to have. The broken wheel had been dragged clear and propped against the embankment by the coachman, awaiting whatever the magistrate's men would eventually wish to make of it, and Verity knelt beside it in the lantern light and turned the shattered axle joint over in her gloved hands with the same close, unflinching attention she gave to a wound that did not yet make sense. The break itself was clean in a way that unsettled her the longer she studied it. Too clean, too even, lacking the ragged, splintered chaos she would have expected of ordinary metal fatigue giving way beneath ordinary strain. Along one edge, faint in the lantern's poor light but unmistakable once she had found the angle to see it properly, ran a series of small, regular scores close together, deliberate. She had seen marks like them before, she realized, kneeling there in the frozen mud with her breath clouding around the lantern, in her father's surgery, on the handle of a bone saw filed too aggressively by an apprentice who had not yet learned restraint. Filing marks. Not the rough damage of an accident, but the patient, careful work of a hand that had known exactly what it was doing and had taken its time doing it. She did not sleep at all that night, though not for once entirely from fear. She sat instead at the kitchen table with the farm wife's own tallow candle burnt down to a stub, sketching the marks from memory onto a scrap of paper for Lord Aldworth's men. And it was that sketch, delivered into the magistrate's hands 3 days later, alongside the coachman's own furious testimony, that turned what might otherwise have remained a tragic accident, quietly absorbed and quietly forgotten, into a criminal matter the law could not decline to pursue. The young groom broke on the second afternoon of careful questioning, not from any cruelty applied to him. Lord Aldworth was, whatever else might fairly be said of him, not a man who required cruelty to extract the truth from a frightened young man already halfway to confessing on his own account, but from the plain, crushing weight of what he had done, sitting now visibly and unbearably upon him, in a way he had plainly not anticipated when the money was first offered. He had been approached in Newcastle, he said, voice cracking, by a man he did not know and had never been given a name for, who had arranged his letters of recommendation, secured his position at Drummond Park, and pressed into his hand a sum he would not have earned in 5 years as an honest groom, all in exchange for a single instruction: weaken the offside wheel, in a manner that would appear to any eye like the ordinary failure of a well-used axle upon an icy winter road. He had not been told to kill anyone, he insisted, weeping openly now, the words tumbling out faster than he could properly govern them, only to cause enough trouble, enough delay that the road to Bath and whatever business waited for the Duke there would be interrupted, postponed, made difficult rather than simple. He had not known, he swore, who truly wanted it done, only that the money had come eventually, traceable through 2 careful intermediaries who had themselves taken some persuading from an account belonging, beyond any remaining doubt, to Cornelius Drummond. Delayed, Lord Aldworth repeated in the flat, weary tone of a man who has heard a considerable number of excuses across a long career and finds this one no more persuasive than the rest that had preceded it. His Grace's collarbone, Miss Merriweather's, forgive me, her Grace's. 3 sleepless nights at his bedside and a fever that very nearly killed him outright were, in your understanding, a delay. Verity, present at the questioning at her own insistence, said nothing for a long moment, watching Josiah's face, young, wretched, genuinely frightened now in a way that had nothing to do with performance, and found, to her own surprise, that what she felt was not the fury she had expected to feel, but something closer to a physician's cold, careful pity for a man who had made one catastrophic decision under the pressure of debt and desperation, and would now spend a very long time paying for it. "Did you know," she asked him quietly, "that the wheel might fail entirely, rather than merely weaken? That it might come away on the steep grade above Farley, rather than hold until a slower, safer stretch?" Josiah looked at her properly for the first time since the questioning had begun, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "I told myself it wouldn't, Your Grace. I told myself it'd hold till the flat road past the hill, and someone would notice the wobble and pull up safe before anything came of it. I told myself a great many things these past weeks that I don't believe anymore." Cornelius was arrested at an inn outside Newcastle 4 days later, attempting, according to the constables who finally ran him to ground, to secure passage to the continent with considerably more haste and considerably less care for appearances than the ordinary settling of an estate matter would have required of an innocent man. He did not resist arrest. He had, Rafferty said afterward, once well enough to hear the full account, the particular defeated stillness of a man who had finally run out of both angles and money at precisely the same moment, and had nothing whatsoever left with which to construct a third attempt. It broke a little before dawn on the 4th day, quietly, without any of the drama she had spent 3 nights braced against. No crisis, no sudden turn for the worse, before the turn for the better, only a slow, unmistakable cooling beneath her palm that she almost did not trust. Having been wrong about hope before in other rooms with other patients, in the years before she had learned to guard herself against wanting a thing too visibly before it had properly arrived. She sat very still with her hand against his forehead for the better part of 20 minutes, timing it against the small mantel clock, refusing to believe it until the evidence had accumulated past the point of reasonable doubt, the way her father had taught her to distrust a single reading and trust only a pattern. The pattern held. The fever did not climb again. His breathing, which had been shallow and quick for 3 days, settled by degrees into something slower, deeper, more nearly ordinary. He opened his eyes properly a little after 7, the light just beginning to grey the curtains, and for the first time in 3 days they found her and stayed on her, clear, present, entirely his own, without the glassy confusion that had clouded every waking moment before it. Verity! His voice was wrecked, barely more than breath, but it was his voice asking rather than simply speaking her name into the dark. How long? 3 days. She could not for a moment manage anything further than that. Her own composure, held so carefully, so deliberately, through every hour of the vigil, finally, quietly, giving way now that it was no longer required to hold. 3 days, and you are going to be entirely insufferable about being fussed over for several weeks yet, and I do not wish to hear a single word of complaint about it. I would not dream of complaining. He tried to lift his right hand toward her face, and found it heavier than he expected, the fever having taken more out of him than 3 days would ordinarily explain. You have been here the whole time. Where else would I be? At home. Asleep or nearly so in a warm bed, rather than exhausted in a farmhouse chair for 3 consecutive nights on my account. He said it lightly, but his eyes, still glassy with the last of the fever, held something more serious beneath the lightness. I do not deserve this particular quality of care, Verity. I have thought about it, in whatever part of my mind was still thinking clearly these past days. I am not certain any man deserves it. You are not permitted to argue with your own physician about her professional judgment, Verity said, though her voice caught slightly on the word physician, exhaustion and relief, both working against her composure, now that the worst of the crisis had finally unmistakably passed. I have made my assessment. You are worth the 3 nights. You were worth them before you struck your head on that doorframe, and you will continue to be worth them tomorrow and the day after. And I would ask you to stop attempting to argue me out of a conclusion I reached a considerable time ago and have found no cause whatsoever to revise." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the grey, strengthening light. "I do not think," he said finally, "that I have ever properly thanked you for the manner in which you argue. Most people, faced with an argument, attempt to win it. You simply state the fact more plainly each time, as though the truth of it were self-evident and only my own stubbornness stood between me and agreeing with you." "It generally is self-evident," Verity said. "You are simply stubborn." "Yes," he agreed, and something that was almost a laugh moved through him, weak but genuine, the first sound of real amusement she had heard from him in 4 days. "I have been told that before. Never, I think, quite so early in the morning by someone who has not slept." "I do not know," he said, "but I am extremely glad you were not there instead." And then, because even fever-wrecked and barely able to lift his own hand, he was still, at bottom, entirely himself, he added, "Was I very tiresome, delirious? I have a vague and troubling recollection of speaking to my father, who has been dead 11 years. You spoke to a great many people who were not in the room," Verity said, "and I told all of them out loud that you were not permitted to die on the grounds that I had not yet finished arguing with you about several matters. I do not know whether any of them heard me. I like to think you did." "I believe I did," he said, quiet now, serious beneath the exhaustion. "I believe some part of me heard you the entire time. I do not know how else to explain why I fought as hard as I evidently did to come back." Dr. Merriweather, summoned from the room where he had finally, at Mrs. Kestrel's firm insistence, allowed himself 2 hours of proper sleep, confirmed within the half-hour what Verity's own trained hands had already told her. The infection had broken, the worst danger had passed, and what remained now was simply the long, unglamorous business of rest, food, and time. Verity, for her part, permitted herself, once her father had left the room satisfied, to put her head down against the edge of the bed beside her husband's uninjured hand, and weep for perhaps the 3rd time in her adult life, with no attempt whatsoever to disguise it, and Rafferty, too weak yet to do much beyond it, moved his fingers slowly through her hair and said nothing at all, because there was, for once, nothing that needed saying. They brought him home to Drummond Park 8 days after the wheel came away from the axle, once Dr. Merriweather judged the fever risk sufficiently past and the road sufficiently clear of ice to permit slow travel. The journey took most of a day. Rafferty propped carefully against a wall of cushions Mrs. Kestrel had insisted on lending, refusing more than once to be treated like something breakable and losing that particular argument every single time. Mrs. Drake met the carriage at the door with her composure fully restored, though Verity noticed, in the unguarded half-second before the housekeeper caught herself, something that looked very much like relief passing openly across her face. "The east bedroom is ready, Your Grace. Fire's been kept high the whole week and cook has beef tea standing by, whether you want it or not." "I find I have very little say in the matter of the beef tea," Rafferty said, allowing himself to be helped down from the carriage with more patience than he had shown for the exercise at any point in the preceding week. "No, Your Grace," Mrs. Drake agreed, with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose authority had just been confirmed. "You do not." The house itself seemed to Verity to exhale slightly as they crossed the threshold, the particular settling quality of a place that had been holding its breath, in whatever manner a house could be said to do such a thing, waiting for the people who belonged in it to come back. The cat appeared from wherever it had been keeping itself and installed itself immediately at the foot of the east bedroom bed, with an air of proprietary satisfaction, as though it had personally arranged the whole homecoming and expected to be thanked for it. Rafferty's recovery took the better part of a month, most of it spent at Drummond Park. With his arm bound tight against his chest and his temper, Verity discovered within the first week, considerably shorter when confined to an armchair by the fire than it had ever once been when confined by 3 years of careful, deliberate silence. She did not mind it in the slightest. She had spent 3 nights genuinely believing she might lose the argument of his life by forfeit, and a short-tempered husband, recovering slowly but surely in an armchair, complaining about the dullness of enforced rest and the indignity of being read to by Mrs. Drake, was measured against that alternative a circumstance she found herself unaccountably and thoroughly grateful for on an almost hourly basis. "You are hovering," he told her on the 10th day, not unkindly, watching her cross the room for the 3rd time in an hour to adjust a blanket that required no adjustment. "I am aware you would prefer to catalogue my pulse every quarter hour indefinitely. I am equally aware that a man recovering from a broken collarbone does not require quite that degree of vigilance, however flattering I find the attention. I am not hovering, I am monitoring." "Are you hovering with a medical vocabulary?" he said, and caught her hand as she passed near enough and drew her down onto the arm of his chair with his good arm, careful of the splintered one between them. "Sit with me instead of circling me. I find I recover considerably faster when you are still." She sat. Outside, the frost thickened steadily on the windows, and the fire held. Poppy Ingram came twice in the course of that month. The first time white-faced and nearly in tears the moment she was shown into the sick room, having heard the news of the accident second-hand, and imagined, she admitted afterward, a great deal worse than the truth. And the second time, a fortnight later, considerably more composed, settling herself into the chair opposite Rafferty's, with the easy familiarity of a woman who had known his wife since they were 12 and had long since stopped being intimidated by dukedoms. "You look dreadful," Poppy informed him cheerfully by way of greeting. "Verity has written to me 3 times this month and mentioned your recovery in every letter, which tells me either that she is very worried or that you are being an impossible patient, and I have concluded, knowing you both, that it is likely some of each." "Considerably more the latter, I am reliably informed," Rafferty said, with the ghost of the dry humour that had been slow in returning through the worst of the fever, and was, Verity noted with quiet relief, coming back to him now in fuller measure with each passing week. "Your friend has taken to reading me improving literature at unnecessary length as a form of discipline." "It is Gibbon," Verity said from the doorway, "and you asked for it yourself and then complained about the length of the sentences, which I did not write and cannot be held responsible for." "I complained," Rafferty said, "about the length of the sentences precisely as a man is entitled to complain when confined to a chair by his own collarbone, and read to for 2 hours by a woman with a very fine voice and absolutely no mercy regarding subordinate clauses." Poppy laughed, a real laugh, delighted. The tension of her first visit fully dissolved, and stayed the better part of the afternoon, and left when she finally did, with Verity's promise of a longer visit once the worst of the season had passed, and a private word to Verity alone in the hall that she would not soon forget. "I have never in my life seen you frightened, in 20 years of knowing you. You were frightened when you wrote to me from that farmhouse. I am glad, more than I can easily say, that I need not have been frightened with you for very much longer." It was on an evening some weeks later, in January now, the worst of his recovery well behind them, that he set down the book he had not, she noticed, actually been reading for some time, and looked at her with an intensity that made her set down her own. "I have been attempting to find the correct way to say this," he said, "for the better part of 3 weeks, which you will note is considerably longer than the 4 attempts it took me to propose to you in the first place, and I have concluded, after due consideration, that there is no correct way to say it, only the plain one." "I have generally found I prefer the plain one," Verity said, "in your case above all others. I watched you through the very worst of that fever. Do for me exactly what you did the first week I ever properly knew you. Assess and act, and refuse absolutely to be frightened out of the work directly in front of you, even when I understand now, from what Mrs. Kestrel told me afterward quite candidly, that you were considerably more frightened the whole while than you ever once permitted yourself to show me." He reached for her hand with his left, steadier now in recovery than it had been in months, though the tremor beneath it remained, and always would, and neither of them had wished it otherwise in a very long time. "I married you 3 years ago now because you looked directly at the single worst thing I believed about myself, and found it, on close examination, entirely unremarkable. I did not fully understand, until that road above Farley, that I had also married the one person in the world who would sit alone in a farmhouse for 3 consecutive nights and refuse, as a matter of plain principle, to let me die of it. I do not know the correct words to thank a person adequately for that kind of courage. I am not entirely certain the correct words exist anywhere in the language. I only know that I intend to spend a great many more years attempting, regardless, to find them. You could simply stay alive, Verity said, her voice not entirely steady by the end of it. I would consider that, on the whole, adequate thanks. I intend to make a very considerable effort in precisely that direction, he said, and drew her hand slowly to his mouth, and held it there a long moment against the warmth of his breath. And outside the frost went on thickening quietly against the glass, and inside the fire held steady. And for the first time since the wheel had come away from the axle above Farley, the whole house was at last entirely and simply quiet. Cornelius Drummond stood trial that spring in a courtroom at Bath, packed tight with precisely the sort of county audience who had once, 3 years before, whispered warnings about a man in a dark coat across an assembly room, and who now leaned forward in their seats to watch that same man's cousin answer for considerably graver sins than a hidden tremor. Rafferty testified first, his arm finally free of its splint, though he still favored the shoulder in cold weather, his voice level and unhurried in a way Verity recognized as costing him a great deal more than it appeared to. He recounted the letters, the London physician stationed at Haverbrook, the sale of the Northumberland property, the moneylender in Newcastle, laying each fact before the court with the same precise economy he brought to his correspondence, offering the magistrate nothing to doubt and nothing to embellish. "Did you at any point," the prosecuting counsel asked, "believe your cousin capable of violence against your person?" "I believed him capable of a great many forms of ruin," Rafferty said. "I did not, I confess, believe him capable of this particular one until the evidence made the alternative impossible to sustain. I had underestimated him. I do not intend to make that error a second time." Counsel for the defense, a thin man with a reputation for finding daylight in cases that had none, attempted on cross-examination to suggest that the whole affair might yet be explained by ordinary misfortune, that axles failed, that roads were treacherous in winter, that a man ruined by debt might sell property for 100 innocent reasons, having nothing whatsoever to do with hired violence. "Your Grace has, by your own admission, a difficult history with your cousin," the counsel said. "Old grievances, old suspicions. Is it not possible you have read a conspiracy into what was, in truth, only bad luck on an icy hill?" Rafferty considered the question with the same unhurried care he gave to correspondence, and did not answer immediately, and the courtroom, Verity noticed, leaned further forward in the waiting. "It is possible," he said finally, "that I have on occasion in my life seen conspiracy where none existed. I do not believe this is one of those occasions, for the simple reason that I did not construct this account from suspicion. My wife found tool marks on the broken axle before any magistrate was involved. A groom confessed, unprompted by threat, to being paid by an intermediary traced to my cousin's own account. I have built a great many careful arguments in my life from considerably less evidence than this, and lost none of them for want of rigor. I would ask the court to extend me the same courtesy it would extend any man capable of counting to 3. There was, Verity thought, watching the jury's faces, something in the particular dryness of that answer that did more to settle the matter than any amount of righteous indignation could have managed. Verity testified after him, called not merely as his wife, but as the physician who had examined the wound, treated the fever, and could speak with professional authority to how near a thing it had truly been. She had not expected, stepping into the witness box in a courtroom full of strangers, to find her hands entirely steady, and was grateful afterward that they had been. "In your professional judgment," the counsel asked her, "was His Grace's life in genuine danger during the period in question?" "For the better part of 3 days," Verity said, "I did not know with any certainty that my husband would live to see the end of them. I have attended a great many fevers in my father's practice. I have rarely attended one I was less willing to leave for even a quarter hour, because I was not confident there would be a second chance to return to it." Cornelius, seated in the dock through all of it in a coat too fine for a man who could no longer afford it, said little in his own defense beyond a brief, brittle assertion that he had never intended anyone's death. Only, as Josiah had said before him, a delay, an inconvenience, a small setback to a rival he had spent 3 years failing to defeat by any legal means available to him. The jury did not take long to find the distinction meaningless. He was found guilty of conspiracy to endanger life, his remaining assets forfeit to the Crown, his name struck permanently from any future claim upon the Drummond estate by an Act of Parliament that Lord Aldworth, with evident and unconcealed satisfaction, personally saw through to its completion within the month. He was transported in the end rather than hanged, a mercy Rafferty insisted upon, quietly but immovably, over Lord Aldworth's own mild objection, on grounds he explained to Verity only once, by the fire, in a voice that admitted no further discussion of the matter, that he had spent quite enough years of his life already defined by his cousin's cruelty, and had no intention whatsoever of spending whatever years now remained to him defined, in turn, by his cousin's punishment. "You could have asked for the harsher sentence," Verity said that evening, watching him stare into the fire with an expression she could not entirely read. "No one would have thought less of you for it, considering everything he took from you, considering how close he came to taking everything." "I thought about it," Rafferty admitted. "For a considerable while, I confess, I wanted exactly that. Then I thought of you, in that farmhouse, refusing to let grief in until there was room for it, refusing to let fear stop you from doing the work in front of you." He looked at her. "You did not survive that week by becoming the kind of person who wants more punishment in the world. I find, on reflection, I would rather become the kind of person who deserves you than the kind who feels satisfied by his cousin's death. The first seemed, on balance, the better use of what remained of my life." She crossed the room and sat on the arm of his chair, the way she had during his recovery, and he drew her down against his good shoulder without needing to be asked, and they sat that way a long while, the fire holding steady, Cornelius Drummond already on a ship, bound for a life neither of them would ever have to think of again unless they chose to. The following winter, the rose garden at Drummond Park lay frosted again, silver and bare exactly as it had the year before, and Verity Drummond stood once more at the same east room window with the same cup of chocolate cooling untouched in her hand, and watched her husband cross the lawn toward the stables, a little slower now than the year before, favouring still the shoulder that had never entirely forgotten Farley, his left hand ungloved and swinging loosely at his side, with a tremor that had grown gently, precisely as she had told him years ago it would, and troubled neither of them any longer, in the smallest degree. The head groom, replacing Josiah in the ordinary course of the household's business, was a steady older man named Corwin, recommended this time not by letter alone, but by 3 years of service at a neighbouring estate, whose owner Rafferty had personally written to inquire after, a precaution he had adopted, quietly and without announcement, for every servant hired at Drummond Park since. Verity had noticed the change and said nothing of it, the way she said nothing of the small additional bolt Rafferty had commissioned for every carriage the estate owned, or the second axle inspection he now insisted upon before any journey longer than a mile, matters a less observant wife might have called excessive caution, and which she understood entirely as the particular shape grief took in a man who preferred to build safeguards rather than speak of fear aloud. Josiah, sentenced to transportation alongside the man who had bought his desperation, sent a single letter before his ship departed for good, an apology badly spelled and entirely, unmistakably sincere, that Rafferty read once in silence and did not burn, and kept instead in the same drawer as an older letter of his own, tucked behind the Edinburgh correspondence, in the place where his wife had once found it and answered it, standing in the early morning light with a book still in her other hand. She practiced medicine still, more openly now than propriety had ever once allowed a duchess to practice anything at all, having discovered, somewhere in the course of 3 sleepless nights in a farmhouse above Farley, that a woman who had kept her own husband alive, through the worst fever of his life, found she cared considerably less than she once had for what propriety strictly permitted her. She had begun, that autumn, to take on a share of her father's overflow patients from Bath itself, and Dr. Merriweather, his gout finally and permanently departed, had taken to introducing her at dinners now as my daughter, the physician, with a pride he made no effort whatsoever to disguise, and no one any longer thought to correct him. Poppy Ingram came to stay for a fortnight that Christmas, as she had for 3 years running now, and brought with her a new husband of her own, a quiet, agreeable young solicitor named Nathaniel Voss, and the four of them spent the long dark evenings by the fire in the East Room in a manner Verity found herself more than once, simply sitting still and grateful for, without any particular reason beyond the plain fact of it. The fire, the frost outside, the people she loved most in the world gathered easily in one warm room, nothing left outstanding, no letter waiting unanswered in a locked drawer, no danger circling at the edge of anything. In the spring following the trial, Verity was called to attend a difficult birth at a tenant farm on the edge of the estate, the kind of case her father would once have taken alone, and which she now took as a matter of course, her bag packed and ready at all hours in a manner that had stopped, sometime in the last year, causing any comment at all among the household. She returned near dawn, exhausted, and quietly satisfied, mother and child both sound, to find Rafferty awake in the East Room, with a lamp burning and a cup of chocolate already warming for her on the hearth, though it was an hour he would ordinarily have been long asleep. You did not need to wait up. No, he agreed, drawing her down into the chair beside him, his left hand finding hers with the small, familiar tremor she had long since stopped cataloguing and simply accepted, the way one accepts weather or the turning of a particular season. I wanted to. There is a difference, I am told by a physician I trust on most matters. Was it a difficult case? A long one. Not in the end a difficult one. She let her head rest against his shoulder, the fire warm against the last of the cold outside, the house entirely quiet around them at that particular grey hour before the birds began. I keep thinking lately how strange it is that a wheel failing on a hill above Farley very nearly took all of this from us, and instead we have this. Mornings like this one, ordinary and entirely unremarkable, and I would not trade a single one of them for anything Cornelius Drummond ever wanted for himself. Nor would I, Rafferty said, and kissed the top of her head, and neither of them spoke again for a while, content simply to sit together in the lamplight until the sky outside began, slowly to grey toward morning. Mrs. Drake, who had chaperoned the very first improper journey to Drummond Park 3 winters before, and had never once, in all the time since, spoken of that period as anything other than the ordinary business of her employment, allowed herself, on the anniversary of the wedding, exactly one remark on the subject, delivered to Verity privately in the corridor, with the particular dry satisfaction of a woman who had suspected the outcome from a considerably earlier date than either of the parties concerned. I told Munby, the very first week you came to examine his grace, that nothing good would come of a physician's daughter, with that particular look in her eye. I am pleased to say I have rarely been so glad to be wrong about anything in my life. Every morning still they took breakfast together in the East Room, where the light came earliest across the frost-white lawn. He read his correspondence with his right hand, steady as ever. She read whatever she happened to be reading, a medical text, a letter from her father, a novel she was fairly certain she had recommended to him weeks before, and which had somehow, again, found its way into his coat pocket. And when she looked up, as she often did, for no particular reason beyond the settled habit of 3 years of marriage, and one long, terrible winter survived together, he was, as he always had been from the very first, already looking at her, with the green eyes that had watched her cross a crowded assembly room in Bath, that had watched her kneel in a frozen ditch above Farley with her own cloak wrapped around him against the cold, and that had never, through any single hour of any of it, quite once stopped. Stories told with quiet love,